You are listening to the IoT for All Media Network.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the IoT for All podcast on the IoT for All Media Network. I'm your host, Ryan Chacon, one of the co-creators of IoT for All. Now, before we jump into this episode, please don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform or join our newsletter at iotforall.com/newsletter to catch all the newest episodes as soon as they come out. So, without further ado, please enjoy this episode of the IoT for All podcast. Welcome, Todd, to the IoT for All show. Thanks for being here this week.
Really appreciate it. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, it's great. So let me start off by just asking you to do a quick introduction about yourself. Just go ahead and give a little background, experience, anything you think is relevant for our audience to get a better sense of who they're listening to.
Absolutely. Well, without boring people to death, let's see. I'm one of the co-founders and the CEO of PubNub. I've been at the company for going on 8 years now, which seems crazy. It's gone very fast. I've been CEO prior at a company that was actually doing virtual events back in the early days when the iPad and the phones were just coming out, and we were figuring out how to do effectively large scale synchronous communication across hundreds of thousands of people so they could participate while watching television, which turned out to be actually really similar to a lot of data patterns with IoT. My career has always been in sort of either founding or working for infrastructure companies and being able to bring that to market and try to translate between somewhat, esoteric infrastructure into kind of business requirements and business value and vice versa. So I've kind of got up the ranks as a founder of a company, founded my first company in 2000, sold that in 2003 to Upwork, and have been a CTO, VP of product management, and now CEO.
That's awesome. Do you want to talk a little bit more about PubNub and kind of what you all do, kind of your focus and how the role you all play in IoT?
Yeah, absolutely. We started the company, actually, kudos to my co-founder, Stephen Blum, our CTO and the original founder of PubNub. The ideas for PubNub came up just a year or two after the App Store was really taking off. And it wasn't solely based on mobile, but I think we saw the explosion of the kinds of experiences people wanted to do with their phones, with their tablets, and with IoT devices that they saw, in Hollywood movies, right? Being able to see where things were in real time, being able to press a button and blow up the submarine like a James Bond movie or something, or maybe turn on a light bulb if you're not a secret agent. Being able to collaborate and communicate with people online. And so we were looking at the technologies people were using to build those kinds of experiences. And what we discovered was whether you're talking about IoT or things that seemed seemingly different, like multiplayer games or, e-learning or chat applications, things that seemed all kind of, disparate and different, we're all requiring the same underlying infrastructure. And that infrastructure requires the ability to connect to devices, send signals at high speed to them in a reliable way, control them. And whether that's a chat message or a device on or off message, it turned out a lot of the infrastructure was the same. So PubNub is really a company that is specifically for providing the infrastructure so that you, the IoT product developer, don't have to think about all of the underlying communication, security, infrastructure related to launching products, and you can just focus on the value of the device or the application itself.
That's awesome. And as it relates to the kind of the applications and devices that, people are utilizing your technology and offerings with, can you talk, expand on that a bit and maybe talk through some use cases that you're comfortable sharing of how your audience kind of uses what you guys bring to the market?
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting. We have way over 1,000 customers now. We have a global network of servers that on which we transact IoT transactions for all of these customers, and these, like I said, all the different use cases I described before. So a few examples. Companies like Peloton, if you think about Peloton, well, it's a large IoT device that you ride a bicycle on. And why is Peloton an exercise bike company whose name we recognize, and we probably couldn't name any other exercise bike brand? And the difference is that it's connected, right? It's a connected device where the experience you have is interactive with all the other people. And if you think about, well, what does that mean? It means taking little bits of data from your device, your, in this case, exercise bike, sending it to other devices, receiving information from other people, and being part of a virtual space where we can exercise together. And PubNub underpins the communication in Peloton, but there's many other IoT companies too. Happiest Baby allows people to monitor their children while they're sleeping. It's a crib company that it's a really neat startup that's done really well recently, and they use PubNub to command and control these devices. So if the baby's heart rate starts to change, they can alert the parents. If you use Logitech Harmony Hub, you're using PubNub. If you use Vivint or Insteon light bulbs and other smart home products, you're using PubNub. We're kind of the underpinnings in communication. I think, let's see, August Locks, Hero, Sprinkle, a number of companies under which we are the communication layer for the kind of command and control of this large population of devices.
Mm-hmm. Oh, fantastic. So I guess before we jump into some more general conversations around what you all do and just kind of your expertise in the market, I'd love to hear a little bit more about kind of the founding of the company that you were, as you were involved in it, and kind of how it got started, the problem and opportunity you saw in the market that kind of just led to what we have today coming out of PubNub.
Yeah, great question. Well, the challenge with let's see, I'm just thinking of the best way to describe it. The challenge with creating devices that communicate with one another involves a lot of knowledge of networking, infrastructure, reliability, security, regulatory compliance, whether it's HIPAA or GDPR. It turns out, like, whenever you start taking a device and connecting online, you're all of a sudden in this world of death by 1,000 paper cuts. And so, before PubNub, you're all of a sudden transitioning from an infrastructure, a company that may be really good at building devices, to one where you're either hiring a large infrastructure team that thinks about internet connectivity and networking and everything else, or you go with a PubNub. And where we really provided value, the hypothesis of PubNub is, how do we make it easy? How do we make it easy with just a couple lines of code, someone who is not necessarily a master's in infrastructure, distributed systems, to have their system work reliably, regardless if it's in India, in North America, if it's in Europe or Africa, and so we kind of set apart this kind of multi-phase strategy of saying, okay, what it takes to do that? Well, first of all, we have to have SDKs that you can plug in that just work, and you just put a couple lines of code and it's doing connectivity, and then we have to have servers distributed all over the world where your IoT device automatically connects to the closest server and then can communicate low latency around that. So we kind of set these rules in mind with this premise that whether you're building, a multiplayer game, an IoT device, or anything else, that you can do this kind of low level communication and connectivity with simple APIs, and that's really taken off. And so our first customers were early stage startups, with like 5 or 10 people, and the next thing you know, we were getting publicly traded companies using us, and all of a sudden we ended up with, like, I think now we have over 2 trillion messages a month going through PubNub that are basically signals from one device to another, with hundreds of millions of devices connected at any given time, and they're all really just building their layer of communication, kind of a real-time communication platform around. So that was kind of where it started, and then the rest is sort of history.
That's awesome. Fantastic. So let me ask you then, just kind of to move away a little bit from just the company speak and talking more about just the general kind of, I guess, view you have into the market. So if the goal of IoT, as we kind of view it, is to let people use data to control devices seamlessly in some fashion or another, where do you think we currently stand on the path to achieving that? And how do we kind of get to that seamless interaction, which I assume is kind of like a goal of your all's and kind of what you're offering to help us get there. But where do you kind of see us currently stand in that progress? And how do we kind of bridge the gap from where we are now to kind of being able to use IoT devices to let people use that data to control them?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's a few critical things to consider here. So first of all, the first phase of or wave of IoT, for all of its promise, was really a data collection problem. And we weren't really thinking about controlling devices. We were looking at, smart meters and sensors that wake up every so often and send a little data point. And when we thought about IoT infrastructure, all we were really thinking about was a large funnel, right? And so you had Kafka and Confluent and a whole bunch of other sort of pieces of infrastructure to do that. where I think it gets interesting and where we've been focusing is really when you turn that around and say, sure, data collection, that's interesting and interesting challenge. But really it comes down to what you were just saying. It comes down to device control. These are devices where I really want to have not only instant view of what's happening, but the ability to change the way that device behaves, door locks, lights, valves, oil rigs. And in order to do that, and that's the first thing, it's kind of that between like just the data collection phase of IoT to now this true, controlling devices anywhere in the world and under low latency conditions. So sort of one is to make the distinction of what you're doing. In terms of the other challenges to solve, the next is that what I think that a lot of IoT platforms get wrong, in fact, why we've never really been an IoT platform per se, is that they think of like IoT as this one problem set. So I need to control that device or connect to it. Oh, but then the user experience, everything else, or the analytics or the reporting or all these other things or the security, well, that's something else. That's someone else's problem. And the challenge with that is it's really not, right? At the end of the day, let's think of the simplest use case. I want an IoT light bulb that I can turn on. Well, it's not just the IoT device I have to program. It's the mobile app. It's my backend reporting. It's security. It's GDPR compliance. It's like all of these things that have nothing generally to do with IoT, but as a person delivering the product, you have to think about. And so the way we think about it a little bit, I guess you could sort of call that vertical integration, or for us, it's more platform integration. So with PubNub, if you have let's say you're building an iPhone and an Android app and a JavaScript app for your browser, and they all can control that light bulb. We have SDKs for all of those things, and they publish a message. And what's cool about that is that message instantly gets not only to the IoT device, but also to an Android phone and an iPhone and an iPad, and also to the vendor servers too, so they can see the status change. So it helps them integrate to like an Alexa or a Google, something like that. And so if you think about it, not so much from a device-centric view of the world, but from a data-centric view, then for us, the devices become agnostic, and we really don't care if it's a chat message in a game or whether it's an IoT control signal. But if you're looking at it from the IoT side, it allows you to create a full end-to-end solution that kind of involves or sort of encompasses security, encompasses the mobile SDKs, encompasses the device SDKs, and the provisioning and the monitoring all together. And I think that's ultimately what you have to deliver when you're building an IoT device, whether it's consumer-based device or a business kind of a industrial device.
So let me ask then, on the consumer versus industrial, what are the needs of like consumer IoT products versus the industrial IoT products, and how is that difference handled? Because I assume you are interacting with tons of different devices across, all different use cases and all different kinds of technology. So how do you kind of view the difference between the devices, as well as how do you kind of approach that as it relates to your offering?
Yeah, really good question. Well, we really made a bet in the consumer space for consumer IoT devices because we see that there are a number of differences, and for us, we realize that the focusing there is probably the best place to start. So some of those differences, right? If you're looking at industrial IoT, there's a huge brownfield challenge to address. And I guess from the term brownfield, I mean that, almost always in those scenarios, there are existing devices in the field, and those devices usually have communication stacks that don't even have a TCP stack on them, right? They're not internet connected. And then you're dealing with these massive integration issues of taking new devices, legacy devices, hooking them together on some industrial site. Those are usually very SI intensive, consultant intensive. So you bring in large team consultants. It's great business for the large SIs in the world. But it ends up with a relatively small amount of internet traffic in many cases, a large amount of SI work, a lot of custom development work. In the case of consumer devices, I think you have a different set of challenges. You've got this challenges of A, I want to get to market quickly, right? B, I have to deal with millions of devices potentially if I'm successful in disparate networking environments. People have different networking setups at home. They're on different ISPs. So I have to support them in a consistent way, even though, they may be in the Philippines and they may be in South Africa. Like, who knows what kind of a thing but I still need to provide a good experience for those consumers. And so the ways you need to think about provisioning, the ways you need to think about regulatory compliances in different regions, the way you need to think about reliability across kind of unreliable internet connections. Those all together end up being an interesting problem set, which we've been really, really laser sharp focused at solving. And I think we've been pretty effective given the customer base there.
So how have you, if you could elaborate a little bit more on that, how have you kind of overcome that challenge and that need, or I guess solving that need for supporting new and old hardware, kind of, on the security side, the encryption side, upgrading side, you just name it as you interact, or you bring together new devices with legacy devices, and you kind of have that mixture probably with every situation that comes up. How have you kind of approached that challenge, and what advice do you have for kind of dealing with a situation like that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, people spend a lot of time thinking about encryption when it comes to security, and yet that's one of the more straightforward sort of binary things. It either kind of works or it doesn't, and if it doesn't work, it's usually because you're on an old library, an old CPU that can't support some of the later things like TLS 1.3 and other sorts of newer encryption protocols that people expect. So there are limitations with respect to older hardware, just with how much horsepower there is and what kinds of AES encryption you can do, let's say, on the hardware. But assuming you get to go away from sort of what's physically possible on a device itself, and you actually now have an encryption library, which we provide, by the way, sort of any number of ways to encrypt the data. I think the questions around security are much broader, right? So as I've mentioned a couple of times now, there's the whole regulatory question, that region by region difference. There's the issue of access control. So maybe the data is encrypted, but how do you know that the device has access to a particular channel of data and not access to others, or that someone can't just listen to that channel? And then, how do you provision a device so when it first comes out of a box, especially a consumer device, when it's not linked to anything, it should have no access? And how do you then securely deliver access to it? A lot of this stuff for PubNub are design patterns around the technology we already have. So for example, provisioning has to do with sending encrypted keys down these private and public channels of data that allow the device to sort of provision itself. And then a lot of it is actually just knowing what are all the checkboxes. Security is like one of those great things where it's like, okay, it needs to be secure, but it takes a security officer to have to sort of outline and say, okay, here are all of the things that make a device secure. And for a lot of companies, they may not have a dedicated security officer, or that security officer may want to go to a vendor like PubNub to sort of ask, well, what is the full scope of considerations I should keep in mind when I deploy a device? And so that's one of the areas we also provide help in, is just, overall kind of solution architecture around these devices.
Sure. So as it kind of relates to the support you all provide, when you deal or work with customers, I assume the level of knowledge that they have around APIs and the web and so forth probably varies greatly, depending on the organization, depending on obviously the individual themselves, whether it's more, kind of, I guess you could compare IoT developers to developers of web and mobile apps that you probably interact with. So how do you guys kind of handle that challenge in kind of the education side and of what it is that you do, and when you're kind of working to not just sell, but also work with customers to bring your technology into their products and then eventually go to market?
It's a great question. I mean, it's very hard to generalize because, every team seems to have a different level of expertise on internet communication and REST APIs and streaming APIs and best practices. I think that it's also changing dramatically. When we stepped into IoT in 2014 and 15, I think that you were just seeing the beginnings of device creators, hardware people, all of a sudden lifting their heads up and going, what? It's more than just firmware? What do you mean there's a TCP stack? What's that? And if you contrasted that with people who had spent, 10 years of their lives building web, or longer, it was night and day. I think now there's a lot more savviness amongst IoT developers, but really for PubNub, it's about, in fact, it was literally our theme for 2020 is keep it simple. Like, how do we really make it easy? Actually was the theme, to be more specific. How do we make it easy for these kind of developers so that, look, even if you have just a basic level of understanding of REST-based or web-based APIs of one sort or another, we can walk you through tutorials, through documentation, through best practices to make it easy to get online. Because you're absolutely right. Like there is a real difference in knowledge for some of these people about an experience, right? And what you want to do is, it's really about two things at the end of the day. It's about reducing risk, and it's about time to market. And if we can do both of those things for customers, it's generally the win for them and for us.
For sure. Yeah. Now, as you've been involved, obviously, with the company since inception, where have you seen, as technology has evolved in the market, where have you seen kind of the biggest challenges that you've kind of faced growing the organization to kind of where it is today? And kind of how have you kind of addressed that challenge, and just any general advice for that approach?
Wow. Well, ask a CEO, it depends what side of the bed he or she wakes up on, and answer that question. But I think, we are building a new product for a new market, and that, is exciting. And it's different than if you're building a new product in an existing market, because not only do you have to develop your product, but you also have to define the space. You have to define the terminology. You have to define the go-to-market. You have to define a lot of things where maybe if you're a better mousetrap, you can always point to other things and say we're better, faster, cheaper, more secure, or whatever your differentiators are. But in our world, I think we have a different challenge, which is, or at least that challenge of defining everything, defining the terminology, like I said, and I think that it's been really interesting. It's been rewarding when we get over one of those hurdles, and when people start using our terminology, or people start seeing the world the way we see it. That's always kind of a big win. But that's always been the biggest challenge for us, I think, is I think we timed the market really well. And our growth rate, I think, reflects that. It's been a pretty exciting time to be at PubNub. But I think understanding when those concepts were going to become more codified across the industry, when those, when the language, the terminology were going to be used, that was a hard thing to predict. And it's been nice to see now really that adoption of the kind of mindset really revolving, not just around us, but we see some of our competitors using the same mindset. We see customers, using our terminology. We're starting to see people think the way we think, which is exciting. But that was one of the harder challenges that we've really struggled with over the years.
That's great. Appreciate you kind of sharing those insights. I know it's not an easy question to answer. I'm sure you could list 100 of those kind of challenges, but it's always interesting to get kind of the CEO's input there. And before we wrap up, I wanted to ask you one quick question, a pretty broad question, just around the kind of the future landscape of the market that you all play in, and as it relates to 5G, as that kind of comes to fruition a little bit more and is more widely used and available, and then at the same time the edge computing side of things, which we're seeing a lot of kind of movement towards, if not already kind of a pretty big shift. So just generally speaking, how do you kind of see edge and 5G changing IoT products, or potentially not changing IoT products?
Yeah, this is a big area of focus for us, because it's sort of, at least on the edge side, something we were already doing. And then with 5G, it really helps tell our story, and I think provides some benefits. So let's address edge first, maybe. So when we talk about edge compute is really, well, first of all, it's an amorphous term because it's defined differently by different people. Some people define edge as being computing on the device itself. Other people talk about computing, at the edge in the network. We define it in the latter way, computing, not at your app servers, but doing the latency sensitive communication or computation as close to the edge of the network as possible. And, as mobile providers start being able to put compute in their network, we're able to move a lot of PubNub into those places. We're actually experimenting with a large telco right now and having some capacity there, and bringing latencies down by the tens of milliseconds, which has been pretty exciting for certain use cases. And that's important for us because we have one of our many sort of API layers is called PubNub Functions, which allows customers to upload those latency sensitive business logic components into our network. And then the closer we can get their code toward the device, the faster things operate. And again, speed is not all that important for a lot of use cases. So I think the lower latency story is a bit oversold. And if you think about, there's a large category of IT devices where frankly, it's like good enough if it's 1 or 2 seconds. No, they don't care that PubNub's under 100 milliseconds worldwide, right? Like it doesn't really matter. I just need to make sure that the light bulb turns off, within a second or two of me pushing the button type of thing. So I think in some cases, it's not a latency story. But it is a distributed computation story, so it's a scaling story, and so Edge provides a whole host of benefits if you can make it easy. And I think the challenge with Edge until companies like PubNub is that it's all been kind of back to that, industrial IoT, strategic, SIs, custom development sort of world. Edge is great from a custom basis, but I think now with PubNub, it's been an interesting way to take what we already have and then just move it out closer to the edge. And then when you kind of pivot to 5G now, where does that fit in? Well, here's the thing about 5G. If you're building request response based IoT products where the device is requesting data from a server coming back, then it's maybe not politically correct to say this, but it's sort of 5G doesn't matter because your latency is not the 4G to 5G connectivity. Your latency really is, and a lot of other issues are really about the servers behind the scaling and everything else there. However, if you are building applications that are message based, around the ideas that we've sold in PubNub, where your devices are constantly transmitting and consuming data on the fly, computation's happening, as close to that edge as possible, then 5G just gives you the added bonus, the added bump, the added experience benefit. And what's nice about PubNub is when you build apps on PubNub, they're instantly 5G ready. What I mean by that is the benefits of 5G all of a sudden sort of appear as soon as your customer base migrates to 5G. And what's nice is a lot of your customers stay on 4G, some get onto 5G, and those consumer devices just work better and better as the population moves more and more to 5G. So that's been a big win for us because we kind of don't have to do anything, but our customers benefit.
Right. That's fantastic. Yeah. That's awesome. So the last couple of things I want to ask you before we finish up here is just generally as it relates to PubNub, are there any kind of new initiatives or news or anything kind of coming out from your guys' end in the coming weeks or months that you'd like to talk about or share, or kind of anything you're excited about and our audience may be kind of able to keep a lookout for?
Yeah, there's a lot of we've grown significantly in the last year from a headcount and from an ability to deliver interesting products perspective. We're not ready to announce anything yet, but interestingly, we are working on a big new piece of infrastructure, which I'll be excited to talk about in a few months or sooner, depending on how fast we get it out there. That I think will have the huge benefits for a number of our use cases, but especially for IoT. And as a matter of fact, the initial concepts for what we're working on came out of our IoT use cases. So I'm pretty excited about where that's going. And we should have that out Q1 next year.
That's awesome. Well, congrats on that. The last question I have is if our audience has any follow-up or questions or wants to kind of engage further, what's the best way to connect with either you or the company just to kind of do a follow-up?
Oh, well, I'm always available at todd@pubnub.com. So easy to email me. I think if you're interested in the company itself, I hate to say just go to our website, but we actually have everything on our web, every product I just talked about, every feature of PubNub is available to try out. All the documentation is there. All the SDKs are there. You can sign up for a free account. You can download an SDK. And we provide unlimited amount, within reason, of free solution architecture support for qualified, for any kind of qualified project. So if you're working on a real project, we're happy to help you out for free. But you can simultaneously play with everything that's there, and sort of then ask us questions. So from our website, you can talk to technical people, you can talk to salespeople, you can talk to product managers. We try to have a very transparent communication flow back and forth. So. But also email me directly. So any of those work.
Fantastic. All right. We'll make sure we link all that up in our description and the rate that we do. But Todd, it's been fantastic to chatting with you. I appreciate you taking some time to connect with me and, and through me, our audience. I think they're going to get a lot of value out of not just discussion, but just learning even more about what it is that you all do and bring to the market. So I thank you again for your time.
Ryan, thank you very much. Really think it's a great podcast and appreciate letting me participate.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. All right, everyone. Thanks again for joining us this week on the IoT for All podcast. I hope you enjoyed this episode. And if you did, please leave us a rating or review and be sure to subscribe to our podcast on whichever platform you're listening to us on. Also, if you have a guest you'd like to see on the show, please drop us a note at ryan@iotforall.com and we'll do everything we can to get them as a featured guest. Other than that, thanks again for listening and we'll see you next time.